Hello and welcome. Today I begin a series of videos aimed at those of you who are just starting to get into classical music or are wanting to dip their toes in. I'm going to do a whole series of videos about this because I know it just can be daunting, the combination of the huge repertoire, the many record labels, all of it, very confusing. But there's also going to be stuff in here for the seasoned collector, and I hope this will be a big help to you. So really, the first thing to think about when you're collecting classical is, well, what do I like? And even going into a used record store that carries classical records can be a little bit daunting. So before I start showing any records, I'm going to talk about a few places where you can go for free and start to get a sense of a repertoire and start to get a sense of what you like. And the most obvious place to begin is radio. I'm going to mention a couple of great American radio stations which carry classical music and have very informed disc jockeys who talk about the music, introduce it, but are not intimidating. They don't get all elitist and artsy-fartsy about it. They make it very accessible. Now, although I'm from England, I live in Los Angeles, and my local classical station is called KUSC out of the University of Southern California. And they have a great range of music that they play. During the day, it tends to be mostly the very well-known stuff. But in the evenings, they have a wonderful show that goes on from, I think, like 7 o'clock until 11 o'clock with Jim Svejda, who's been doing this for years. And what's great about him is he's a little quirky, eccentric, but he really knows his stuff. And he plays lots of very interesting, both mainstream recordings, but also recordings which you may not have heard of, even if you're a seasoned collector like myself. He also often has guests in the studio, musicians who are in town to play with the LA Phil, and every year he does a wonderful series of interviews with those film composers who are nominated for Oscars. And actually film music plays a big part in the programming on the station. Another station I would highly recommend is WFMT out of Chicago. It's actually run now by someone I worked in radio with when I worked at WBUR in Boston. And he is keeping the flames of classical music alive in Chicago. And they, of course, broadcast the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. You can listen to both of these stations, stream them online. And so it's very easy to check out all the different kind of stuff that they play. You can go online and see if you miss what a particular piece is. You can go online, find out what it was, what recording it was, and they have links to where you can buy those recordings. Now, I do want to mention something else, which is the BBC in England, which is what I grew up with. And they have a whole station, Radio 3, dedicated to classical music. And you can listen to them live online, and most of their programming is also archived for 30 days. One of the best shows to get you orientated to the whole area of classical music and also learn a little bit of history behind the pieces is a weekly show that's been going on for years. I used to listen to it as a kid. It's called Record Review, and they will play new releases. They will also do a feature called Building a Library, where a particularly mainstream work, a guest reviewer comes in and talks about all the different recordings and selects a favorite or several favorites. Beyond that, there's some very good news magazine type programs like Music Matters. And then, of course, there's lots of live concert broadcasting, especially in the summer. The proms from the Royal Albert Hall, which are an amazing institution. It's a music festival that goes on for several months. Orchestras from all around the world, really unusual programming, and as well as mainstream stuff. You get to hear some of the greatest musicians alive, and those are all archived. Again, you can listen to them for 30 days. I'm going to put links to all of those resources at the bottom of this video, And that's a great way to just dip your toes in the water. So now to the whole business of buying classical records. And I was trying to think where to start on this video, and I thought a great place to start would be to talk about the first classical records that I really got into, that I owned. And we're starting pretty young here. I discovered my love of music probably from pretty much the moment I was aware of such things. Now, my father just had one of those old little portable record players that kind of looks like a little suitcase, and that was the record player. And he had a bunch of records, and those were really the first records that I got into and the music that I got into. Now, the first record we have to talk about, this was the first record that really got me into classical music, is this one, Holst the Planets. Now, this is an old mono recording. This is not the actual record that was in our house, but it is a copy of the exact record. And The Planets by Holst is one of the all-time most popular classical music pieces, and for good reason. It uses a huge orchestra. It tells the story, essentially, of each of the astrological signs that the planets are associated with. For example, you have Mars, the bringer of war, Venus, the bringer of peace and love. It goes on. And so the music is, in a way, telling a story. And one of the ways that many people get into classical music, to begin with, is through music that tells a story. This is the granddaddy of them all. It is a spectacular work. Now, this record, made in monos, conducted by a very famous English conductor called Adrian Boult, and he made many recordings of this work and was indeed a great friend to the composer Gustav Holst. This is not a recording I would necessarily recommend for you to go and get unless you're just a completist, but one of the best recordings out there is one of his later versions of this. Here we go, with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, one of the best orchestras in London, very distinctive, rich sound, wonderful in English music, people like Elgar, Vaughan Williams, etc. This was his last recording. Here you can see him with his rather splendid Edwardian moustache, and it's a fold out, so it's got some great pictures of the sessions and a nice piece on Holst, etc. This is recorded on EMI, and EMI has some of the greatest, not only just in terms of the musicians, but greatest recordings in terms of the sound. And a particular recording duo who worked on this recording. This recording is from, I think it's around 1979, Christopher Bishop and Christopher Parker. And they made a whole series of fantastic recordings on EMI. Now, with all these labels like EMI, Decca, the British labels, you always want to go for the English pressings. Absolutely essential. Do not go near the American pressings. Decca's slightly different. It's a whole more complicated story. Decca, London, as long as the record was manufactured in England, that's fine. But these EMIs, HMVs, you want to go for the English pressings. This is probably my favorite of Adrian Boult's various recordings. Now, there are several audiophile classic versions of this record. Here's another one. Again, produced by Christopher Bishop and Christopher Parker. This is with Andre Previn conducting the London Symphony Orchestra, a wonderful team, produced many fantastic recordings over the years. This record exists in many versions. You can get one of the original pressings, which I have. You can get, I think there are two Japanese pressings, one which is it's either pressed at 45 or it's just spread over 4 sides. That is fantastic. This is a recent reissue, relatively recent reissue by a label called what are they called again? Yes, Haiku Supercuts. Now, the thing about this series, this is an amazing series of reissues. They're done all analog, and you always want to get an all analog version of these analog recordings. The vinyl, the quality of the vinyl varies. So some pressings are a little bit poppy and crackly, others are not. It's just you kind of have to see what happens. This is fine. This is a really great version of it. I think my favorite is the Japanese one spread over 4 sides, but also the original, what they call postage stamp version, sounds really good. Really good indeed, in fact. Another audiophile version of this, which seems to be reissued by every company in sight, is this one, done by Zubin Mehta and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. They did a whole series of recordings here in LA in UCLA's Royce Hall, a fantastic recording venue. All of their recordings for Decca are excellent, and it's a great performance. This is a reissue on Speaker's Corner. Speaker's Corner does many classical record reissues, and especially of the Decca catalog, and they are highly recommended, all of them. It also came out in this version on a Japanese label called King Super Analog. Now, I'm a huge fan of this range of reissues of the Decca catalog and the London catalog. But the records are not only remastered, all analog again, they are to a degree remixed. They have sometimes a somewhat darker quality to the sound than other versions, but I really like them. And if I was to pick one version of this record, it would be this King Super Analog, but these can be a little pricey now to find. Okay, next record. This was the record that made me want to play the cello. And this is Voorjacks' Cello Concerto. And this here is a recording, again on Decca. This is a later re-release, budget re-release. And it's with Raphael Kublik conducting the Vienna Philharmonic and the great Pierre Fournier playing the cello. It's a mono recording, but it makes no difference. It's a beautiful recording. Vienna Philharmonic is one of those orchestras. Their records are just great. They're a fantastic orchestra. They have a very distinct kind of sound because they have somewhat different brass instruments and wind instruments which are actually passed down within the orchestra from player to player. It gives their sound a very distinct, very almost a golden hued sound, and also their string sound is very famous. Vienna Philharmonic records, you can't go wrong. Now, this is the actual record that I had, and I played it to death. Decca had a number of re-release labels, and they're all really good. This one is called Decca Eclipse. You can see the original label here. I have a feeling this record was re-channeled for stereo. In general, you want to avoid those. You want to just get if it's a mono recording, just get the mono version. Many of them sound fantastic, but that recording has been reissued by King Super Analog. It's glorious. It's not one of the more better known of the King Super Analog reissues, so you can find these, and sometimes at a fairly reasonable price. Pierre Fournier was one of the great cellists of the 20th century, and he recorded this again for Deutsche Grammophon in stereo. It's a really good recording, but this is the one I prefer, this mono version. So, the next work that just totally caught my imagination, and these are all records that I was listening to when I was about 6, 7, 8, 9, and one of the reasons I'm talking about these is if they can appeal to a kid, they're probably going to appeal to anyone. There's going to be no prizes for guessing that this was very popular with me. Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Ballet. Again, this is one of those pieces scored for a large orchestra, beautiful orchestration by Tchaikovsky, fantastic melodies. It is my favorite of the three ballets. I think it was the last of the three that he wrote. Again, this is not the actual record that my father had, but it is the same record. And it's a mono recording with a conductor who was very much associated with ballet music, recordings of ballet music, Anatole Fistulari. There's a wonderful collection of his recordings on the Decca Eloquence reissue label, which I highly recommend. It's a couple of CDs. Also, some of his recordings have been reissued in the RCA Living Stereos, done first by Classic Records and then by Analog Productions. Again, I wouldn't say go out and buy this, but let's talk about some of the great versions, different versions of Nutcracker that you can get. Now, here's one that's going to be a surprise to many of you. I'm going to talk first about recordings of the suite from the Nutcracker. That's a series of extracts from the ballet that Tchaikovsky put together to actually try and get the public aware of the music. And it's one of the things that drove the success of the piece in subsequent years. So talking of recordings of the suites, there are many, many, many of them. Everyone records them. I am particularly fond of the Karajan Decca recording, which I have around here somewhere. I have an original. I should have dug that out. Anyway, but here's a version which you might not immediately think of. This is conducted by the great cellist Miroslav Rostropovich with the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, I'm going to do separate videos later on about the different classical labels, Decca, EMI, Deutsche Grammophon. Deutsche Grammophon is complicated. It's not generally considered an audiophile label, but for sure it contains incredible performances, incredible musicians. In general, the early, what they call large tulip pressings, if you can get those are all tube mastered records, and those continue on until the sort of late 60s. Those records are collectible. But later ones like this, where you have a smaller label, you can kind of see no big tulips. These do not always have the best reputation for sound. But this is a complicated area. You actually can find records, later Deutsche Grammophon records, which sound excellent. And this is one of them. The performance is superb. Now, legend has it that Herbert von Karajan, who was the regular conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic and who had recorded this suite from the Nutcracker with over the years, knowing Rostropovich was going to come and make this record, this was a time when Rostropovich was turned into conducting as well as continuing to be one of the greatest cellists who ever lived. He drilled the orchestra. But I don't think that's giving enough credit to Rostropovich. This performance is so much better than Karajan's own recordings on Deutsche Grammophon. It is just fizzles and sparkles, and the recording itself is really good. This is just, I have both a regular English pressing, a regular German pressing. They both sound wonderful. Just as a performance, this is one of my favorites, and I listen to this all the time. And you've got this really wonderful extra of a short piece for cello and orchestra by Tchaikovsky called the Andante Cantabile. And look, there you can see him playing with the orchestra. There we go. Now, if you don't want to buy the complete ballet, here's another really great option. Again, on this audiophile reissue label, Haiku Supercuts. And this is still available. In fact, I got this in a sale from Elusive Disc, which is one of the online stores, which sells a lot of great reissue vinyl. I got this for like at half price, so I only paid about $17 for it. This is a single record version of the ballet. Now, this dates from, I think it's the late 50s. Originally an EMI recording again. The Haiku Supercuts focus on all EMI recordings. And again, it's a great engineering team. Peter Andre, Neville Boyling, recorded March 1958 in the Kingsway Hall, London. Kingsway Hall was the scene of some of the greatest classical recordings ever, both by Decca and EMI. Now, this is directed by a conductor called Ephraim Kutz, conducting the Philharmonia Orchestra. And the Philharmonia Orchestra is one of the top of the London orchestras. There are actually 5 world-class orchestras based in London. The Philharmonia was kind of started as a orchestra to make records, and by an EMI executive called Walter Legg, and he used this to attract some of the top conducting talent, including Karajan. This is where Karajan worked for many years before he took over the Berlin Philharmonic. Carlo Maria Giulini also made a series of great records with them. Kurtz, not so well known, but he did 3 of these single album extracts from Tchaikovsky ballets, and this one, The Sleeping Beauty, Swan Lake, they're wonderful. This is a really wonderful performance. So if you just want to get a one record version, go for this. You can also find this in original EMI pressings, both from the very first one to various reissues. In general, those all sound really good. There will, on an early recording like this, the first pressing, which will be tube mastered, will sound the best, but reissues of these are great. Again, only British pressings. Now, to the complete ballet. You've got several choices. Now, one of my favorites is this recording on Mercury by Antal Dorati with the London Symphony Orchestra. This, for some reason, has never been reissued by any of the audiophile vinyl labels, which seems amazing to me, because this is one of the best sounding, best performed versions. Now, Mercury, as many of you may know, was one of the labels, the American labels, which did absolutely fantastic audiophile recordings starting in the 50s. Along with RCA Living Stereo. Mercury, and yes, this is one of them, they recorded to 35mm film just with a sound stripe on it, and they got incredible fidelity from using that medium. Very little degeneration of the sound over the years. I don't know why this hasn't been reissued. I picked this up for next to nothing at Tower Records. You can see it has one of the earlier labels. The vinyl is not dead silent like it would be on a really quality reissue. But it doesn't matter. It is such a great performance. Highly, highly recommended. Another great performance from a vintage audiophile performance is this one on Decca with Ernest Ansermet, with the Suisse Romande Orchestra, which was his regular orchestra. You see it comes with this lovely book. This is an original pressing, and it has the early Decca label, the wide band with the letters in that way. That means it's a very early, all analog tube pressing. This has also been reissued by Speaker's Corner, so you can find this, hopefully not for too much money. Yeah, the Decca recordings are just wonderful, and all the recordings made by Ansermet for Decca in Switzerland are just wonderful magic. I will be doing a video just on these records at a future date. So this is a lovely alternative. Again, you can spend big bucks on this original, or you can go for one of the Decca reissues, or an English-made London reissue, or go for the Speaker's Corner version, which has beautiful silent vinyl. Finally, with regards to the Nutcracker, I have to mention this set, the Royal Ballet. Now, it's just a suite from the Nutcracker, but it is fantastic. This is considered one of the greatest classical audiophile releases ever. This particular version was put out by Classic Records, and you can see it has the insert that slides in and out of the box like this. It has a rundown of the tracks and a beautiful book with beautiful artwork and descriptions of the music, photos. This set, which is now available from Analog Productions, Acoustic Sounds. This Classic Records set is long out of print. I happen to really like this version. I also have this version on the 45 RPM box. So this is readily available from Analog Productions. The recording is absolutely spectacular. It is ensemble conducting again with the Orchestra of Covent Garden, which is where the Royal Ballet performs. It has a lovely selection from all the classic ballets. You've got the Nutcracker, Coppelia, Giselle, Swan Lake, Carnival, The Sleeping Beauty, Les Sylphides. Just plenty to listen to. Recorded by one of the legendary Decca engineers, Kenneth Wilkinson. His recordings are always superb. So to buy an original of this is going to cost you a lot of money. It's not going to sound as good as the current reissue. So this is great, not only just for the Nutcracker, but just as a wonderful introduction to ballet music, and it's all very accessible. So to wrap up this first video of the first classical records that I bought, that I think you would like very much, well, Beethoven. And this record that my father had of the Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony. Again, this is an old mono recording. This is from the first cycle of the Beethoven Symphonies recorded by Herbert von Karajan with the Philharmonia Orchestra in London. This is not the actual record my father had. This is a newer copy, but it's mono. This is actually, I think, the best recording of a Pastoral Symphony, Symphony No. 6 that Karajan made. It has a warmth, a spontaneity, which I don't think is quite matched in any of his later recordings. But you're probably going to want to go for something more up to date. The thing about the Sixth Symphony, again, it tells a story in music. Each movement describes a particular scene in the country, culminating in, well, it begins with the composer going for a walk in the country. Then we're there on a beautiful balmy summer day, and it's all the birds talking to each other, the different instruments, the wind instruments in particular, mimicking birdsong. And then you end up having a sort of peasant dance which gets driven away by a storm. It's one of the early examples in classical music of composers, or at least very famous examples of composers mimicking storms in music, and then a big celebration when the storm passes. I'm going to bring out a couple of other really great recordings of this. Here we go. This is one that many of you will be familiar with. This is the recording by Bruno Walter, one of the great conductors of the 20th century. he re-recorded a lot of his repertoire late in life with a scratch orchestra in LA, consisting of many of the greatest studio musicians in the city. And all these recordings, he re-recorded all the Beethoven, Brahms symphonies, other works too. They were recorded beautifully, but you may not have realized that if you had the original records, because CBS was notorious for not having very good pressings of their records. If you can get the earliest pressings, like the 6 eyes, even the 2 eyes sound pretty good. You'll get some sense of it, but the best way to hear something like this is in a repressing, remastering. This one is done by Analog Productions again. It's got a lovely fold out here, pictures of a conductor. I love the whole cycle conducted by Walter. In a later video, I will be talking about complete cycles of the Beethoven symphonies, and his complete cycle will be something that I will be showing you. Another re-release of reissue that's just recently come out of a fantastic recording of this work is this, by the Vienna Philharmonic and Karl Böhm, one of the great German conductors of the 20th century. His cycle of the Beethoven symphonies is one of the best, but this particular recording of the 6 is incredible. This reissue is actually a new reissue label done by Project, who also make turntables. You see it's beautifully presented. There's a photograph of the original tape, notes, and then a photo of Böhm behind. It's spread out over the symphony on 3 sides, and then the Egmont Overture on the 4th side. I'm not quite sure where they pressed this. The vinyl could be quieter, which just brings to a point that I should make, is that if you have any intention of playing classical music or buying used records, you really do need to get some kind of cleaning machine. At best, a vacuum machine, or spend bigger bucks on one of the more expensive machines like the Audio System, or at least do something, because classical records, they really need to be quiet for you to fully enjoy the music. Cleaning not only gets rid of a lot of the surface noise, but it really improves the sound of these records. And just as a sort of follow-up on Beethoven symphonies, here is the complete set that Karajan recorded with the Berlin Phil in 1963. And if you're going to buy one set of the Beethoven symphonies on vinyl, this is the one to go for, at least as a starting point. Again, I will be doing a video in which I'll be discussing a whole bunch of these recordings. I got given this in a slightly later edition for my 10th birthday. It was the first sort of big classical music record set that I was given when I was 10. And it was the reissue of these symphonies done for the complete Beethoven edition that Deutsche Grammophon put out in 1970. Again, that is long lost. This is, however, an earlier pressing, and this is a pressing you want to get. And it has what I have mentioned before, the large tulips on the label. These are beautiful records. Once you clean them up, they're dead silent. They're all tube mastered. That means it's early enough in the manufacturing process that the companies were still using tubes in their mastering chain, and it makes a huge difference. Once they switched over to transistors, the sound gets a little drier, a little less rich. You can either buy this complete set, you can find it readily online for not too much money, or you can build up the collection album by album. It also has a really nice book with all kinds of notes and photographs, a maestro in full flight. Loves to have photographs of himself, maybe the singers in the ninth. This is still, I think, the best recording of the Ninth Symphony on the musical level. The quartet of soloists, it's just a fantastic recording. Now, if you've got the cash, this set was reissued by Speaker's Corner in very limited numbers. It now can cost quite a bit. It's all, again, all analog, mastered. It just has, I would just say, a tiny bit of extra refinement to the sound over this original pressing, but you're good either way. So there we go. This is the end of this video, part one. In part two, I'm going to talk about some other records, some of which were my first records, and others which you can readily get reissues, etc., or easy to find originals, all of which cover a range of music which can help you start getting into classical. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.